Katherine Willoughby, who would end up as Katherine Brandon and Katherine Bertie, would become Duchess of Suffolk, adoptive parent to a Queen's child, and an exile for her Protestant faith. She was a noblewoman who never held back in her opinions, and while this at times made her unpopular, Katherine was never far from the drama of her time. Katherine was born at Parham Old Hall, Suffolk, on the 22nd of March 1519, the daughter of William Willoughby, 11th Baron Willoughby de Eresby. He was a substantial landholder in Lincolnshire, Norfolk and Suffolk, and the lack of any higher noble in those parts meant William was seen as a significant person in matters of administration for all three areas. His status was raised even further when in 1516 he married Maria de Salinas, a Castilian noblewoman who came over to England with Catherine of Aragon, and was a close friend of the Queen as well as a lady-in-waiting to her. It appears Maria was fond of England, as she was known by Spanish ambassadors to have apparently influenced Queen Catherine to favour her new English subjects. Henry VIII was also delighted at another Spanish-Anglo alliance between some of his subjects, and one of his ships, the Mary Willoughby, may have been named after her in recognition of this. In turn, Catherine herself was likely named for the English queen who was the friend of her mother, along with many other girls of her generation. Catherine was her father's only surviving child, and so when he died in 1526, there was a contest for his inheritance, as Catherine was not a boy. It was contested by Sir Christopher Willoughby, William's brother, who refused to give up control over several properties in Lincolnshire. Maria managed to muster support at court, and Christopher received a reprimand from Cardinal Wolsey, who had in turn been sent a letter by Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, about the situation. However, Charles's intervention was not without benefit to himself. On her father's death, Catherine became a ward of the king despite her mother still being alive. This often happened to children of the nobility on the death of a father, partly because mothers didn't have any rights, and partly to take the financial strain off the mother. Charles Brandon was busy collecting up land in East Anglia, and funnily enough, Catherine's inheritance would help with that. He took out loans to purchase her wardship from Henry in early 1528 or 1529, and she joined Charles's household. Charles was married at the time to his third wife, Mary Tudor, sister of the king. It was a love match that at the time had been scorned, as they had married in secret against Henry's wishes, but by 1529 both had long since been forgiven by the king. It was rumoured Catherine was to be betrothed to Henry Brandon, Earl of Lincoln, the young son of Charles and Mary. But this would change after just a few years. On the 25th of June 1533, Mary died, and Catherine was a chief mourner at her funeral. Rumours had long abounded, probably coming from Anne Boleyn, who disliked Mary Tudor, that Charles was far more interested in the young teenage girl in his household than he should have been, even while Mary was still alive. Added to this was the fact that although everyone expected Catherine to be betrothed to Henry, it never happened, and it's possible he was sickly as he died in 1534. Charles instead married Catherine himself in September 1533. He was 49 years old and Catherine was just 14. It wasn't completely unusual for the time period, but age gaps were starting to become less prevalent, and Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador, found it interesting enough to comment on the marriage for that reason. Another reason for the sudden marriage may have been that Charles was in need of cash, and he couldn't afford to wait for his son to come of age. Marrying Catherine also made it easier to take those finances directly, rather than going through young Henry. Despite the years between them, it would be a successful marriage. Now as her husband, Charles was able to force Christopher Willoughby to give up more lands that actually belonged to Katherine, adding to his own impressive portfolio. This would allow him to become the highest magnate in Lincolnshire, and he would later play a significant part in quelling the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 as a result. As for Katherine, she now became a duchess and gained a husband with clout at court. Furthermore, she also now became connected to the royal family, as the children of Mary Tudor were considered heirs to the throne, and Katherine became stepmother to Henry, who she might have otherwise married, Eleanor and Frances, who went on to be the mother of Lady Jane Grey, as well as Anne and Mary, daughters to Charles through his second wife, Anne Brown. The couple also raised an imposing residence for what would become their main home after 1537, Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire. It wasn't long before children came along. Henry, born almost a year after their marriage on the 18th of September 1534, and Charles, named for his father, who came along a year after in late 1537. The family stayed on at Grimsthorpe now, as in the wake of quelling the Pilgrimage of Grace in Lincolnshire, Henry ordered Charles to remain in the north to make the royal presence felt there. Charles and Katherine also seemed to get on well on a personal level. Mary Tudor had been a strongly spoken woman who wasn't afraid of standing up to her brother, and Katherine was also witty and opinionated. So it seems Charles had a thing for strong, outspoken women. Katherine also had a love of learning, which was encouraged by her husband. She had also been given a good education by her mother when younger, as evidenced by the writings and translations Katherine left us. They continued to be a close part of the royal entourage, however. When Anne of Cleves arrived in England in 1539, the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk were part of the official welcoming party, and they would help arrange a royal progress for the King and Catherine Howard in 1541. This progress would later become known for the secret meetings between the Queen and Thomas Culpeper, although apparently their home at Grimsthorpe was one of the few places nothing happened. Now in her early 20s, Katherine became an advocate for Protestantism. However, despite Henry VIII's break from Rome, many of her beliefs were still considered heresy, and so she remained quiet in public about these. Katherine also strongly disliked Bishop Gardiner, a devout Catholic, and although they had once begun as friends, by all accounts the feeling was mutual by this point. At a dinner party she and Charles once held, the guests had to play a game in which they sat with the person they liked the best. As Katherine could not sit with her husband, the host, she chose instead to sit with Bishop Gardiner as the person she liked the least. She also named her pet spaniel Gardiner, so she could have fun shouting, "Gardiner, heel!" and "Gardiner, roll over!" In 1543, Katherine also became close friends with the king's final wife, Catherine Parr, and this only strengthened her leanings towards Protestantism, as Parr was also an advocate for the Reformation. However, this association would cause the Duchess problems just a few years later. On the 22nd of August 1545, Charles died. Katherine purchased the wardship of her two sons, as well as the right to choose who they would marry when old enough. This left Katherine a young widow in her mid-20s, and while she was also able to maintain her autonomy as she was still wealthy, it also made her more vulnerable to possible court intrigues. She was almost swept up in the attempt to remove Catherine Parr from the king's side when Catholic advocates tried to rid themselves of Protestant leaders in Henry's later years. And it was even suggested Henry was considering Catherine herself for wife number 7, something which she no doubt was glad never came true. But once Henry died in 1547 and his son took the throne as Edward VI on the 28th of January 1547, Katherine found her situation much easier. She was able to openly help her friend, the Dowager Queen, with funding one of her books, The Lamentation of a Sinner, and as Edward made it clear his reign would be a Protestant one, used her near-endless purse to pay for other patronage. More than a dozen books either carried her coat of arms or were dedicated to Katherine, and she became a patron of John Day, the country's leading religious publisher at that time. The Duchess was shown as a shining example of why women should be allowed to read the Bible, and she even arranged for Hugh Latimer to conduct sermons at Grimsthorpe. Katherine also had a hand in helping to establish stranger churches, a name given to the churches of European Protestants in England for Protestants fleeing persecution in Europe. But tragedy wasn't far away, and in late August 1548, her friend Catherine Parr gave birth to a daughter before dying on the 5th of September, having never left her childbed. This was a sad enough event, but when Parr's fourth husband, Thomas Seymour, was arrested for treason and executed in March 1549, the Duchess was given the responsibility of being a guardian for Catherine Parr's daughter, Mary. Mary was only a baby of 7 months old, but being the daughter of a former queen, she was expected to be kept in a style befitting her station. Expense accounts for Catherine's household show Mary was dressed in the finest fabrics, slept in a well-stocked nursery of toys and fine furniture, and was given the best food. It wasn't long before the Duchess, who had no husband to add extra income and her own 2 sons to support, began to resent the extra money she needed to spend on a child she hadn't expected to look after. She wrote to William Cecil complaining about the situation, asking for funds to help support the child. The letter was eventually taken notice of, as Parliament passed an act in January 1550 to allow little Mary to be rid of her father's attainder and to gain some of his lands, although she still wasn't permitted to hold any of Seymour's titles. However, no claim was ever made on the lands, and any record of Mary or her place in Catherine's household disappears around this point. It's highly likely the child died sometime before her 2nd birthday and was probably buried close to Grimsthorpe. In 1551, Catherine's sons, now both in their teens and students at Cambridge, became ill with the sweating sickness passing through England in that year. In an attempt to flee the disease, the 2 boys had gone to Buckton in Cambridgeshire and were staying at the Bishop of Lincoln's palace. On the 14th of July 1551, Henry, 2nd Duke of Suffolk after his father's death, passed in his bed, resulting in his brother Charles, sick in the bed opposite him, becoming the Duke of Suffolk for a very short while, before dying an hour later as well. It was a bitter loss for Katherine, and she fell into deep mourning. 4 months later, she wrote a poignant letter to William Cecil, in which she said, "Truly I take this, God's last and to the first sight most sharp and bitter punishment, not for the least of his benefits, inasmuch as I have never been so well taught by any other before to know his power, his love and mercy, my own wickedness, and that wretched state that without him I should endure here." In other words, Katherine managed to find some comfort in her faith, although sadly she considered the death of her sons to be a punishment for her shortcomings. It would have an immense effect on her faith and her choices in the years to come. The Duchy of Suffolk now reverted to the crown and would later be passed to the heirs of Mary Tudor, but Katherine still held the inheritance to the barony of Willoughby of Eresby. Just a few years before, Richard Bertie had joined Catherine's household as her gentleman usher, someone who dealt with business on her behalf as well as helping to maintain her large properties. He was a well-educated man who had a skill with several languages, and he had a sharp wit to match Catherine's to boot. They were also close in age, as Richard was just 3 years older than she was. It wasn't long before a friendship blossomed between them that turned into love, and they were secretly married sometime in 1552. It was unusual for a noblewoman to marry lower socially, but it was obviously a love match. Their marriage was a happy one, and Katherine even attempted to have Richard made Baron Willoughby de Eresby, but his non-noble birth made it difficult. A fictional heritage was made for him to strengthen his case, in which it was argued his ancestors had come over from Bertieland in Prussia with the Saxons. But with the ascension of Mary I to the English throne in July 1553 after Edward VI's death, their lives were about to get more difficult. At first, they kept a low profile, and Katherine gave birth to a daughter named Susan in 1554. But by June of that year, Bishop Gardiner saw his opportunity and suddenly claimed that Katherine's first husband Charles owed the crown £4,000, an enormous sum of money, and he wanted her to repay it. Richard was invited to meet with Gardiner to discuss the repayment, but it quickly became an interrogation of their religious beliefs. Many Protestants had decided to hide their faith privately or make concessions to allow them to exist under Mary's regime, but the former Duchess and her husband did not. Upon returning home, Richard and Katherine began to make plans to flee England. In February 1555, Richard, Katherine, their baby daughter, and a small retinue went abroad. Katherine was also pregnant just a few months later with a second child with Richard, a son born in October 1555, which they named Peregrine after their peregrinations in exile. They would travel across Europe through Wesel, Strasbourg, and Frankfurt, ending in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in Zamagosia as guests of the Polish king, rapidly running out of money as they went. Richard's fluency with Latin and French also aided them out of many predicaments, according to his later account of their trials and tribulations in the 1570 publication of Fox's Book of Martyrs. They were apparently made administrators in the Lithuanian region, and it's unclear whether they planned to stay there forever or return home at some point. But with Mary's death on the 17th of November 1558 and her Protestant-leaning sister Elizabeth taking the throne of England, Katherine and Richard finally felt safe enough to return home. Their travels were made into a popular ballad by Thomas Deloney, the most rare and excellent history of the Duchess of Suffolk's calamity, and as a play by Thomas Drew, The Life of the Duchess of Suffolk, which was published in 1624. The fact it was still interesting 60 years later shows how big of an impact their story had. They had returned to England by the summer of 1559, and Katherine's lands were restored to her once again. Richard would go on to become an MP for Lincolnshire, although he would never become Baron Willoughby de Eresby, but the title would later pass to their son, Peregrine. Katherine also once again picked up her extensive patronage where she had left off, and the puritanical nature of Katherine and Richard's Protestantism was at odds with Queen Elizabeth's more moderate form of it. This led to tension between Katherine and Elizabeth, and the former Duchess often sent letters to her equally moderate friend William Cecil, urging him to do more to promote Protestantism. Katherine also held property in the autonomous parish of the Minories in London, an extra-parochial parish which meant it was considered to be outside of any ecclesiastical parish. As such, it became a centre for Puritan preachers, many which received patronage from Katherine. She also hired Miles Coverdale, a Protestant preacher who had produced the first complete printed translation of the Bible into English in 1535, to tutor her children. Many of those Catherine extended patronage to were outspoken about the Elizabethan version of the Protestant Church, and some even ended up in prison for the things they said. However, Catherine was still respected enough to be considered a safe pair of hands and to enact change for her family. In August 1567, Catherine's step-granddaughter, Lady Mary Grey, was sent to live with Catherine under house arrest for marrying without Elizabeth's permission. The former Duchess was shocked at how little Mary brought with her, but Lady Mary lived happily with her for 2 years, becoming close to Peregrine and Susan. In 1570, Catherine's daughter Susan married Reginald Grey of Rest, and Catherine convinced the Queen to restore the title of Earl of Kent, held by his grandfather, to Reginald, also allowing her daughter to become Countess of Kent until his death just a year later. In her later years, Catherine seems to have suffered on and off with illness, and a 1580 book by Theodore Beza contains a dedication to her that mentions her ongoing struggle with ill health. She died on the 19th of September that year, and while it's uncertain where Catherine died, it may have been at Grimsthorpe as she was buried in Lincolnshire at Spilsby. Catherine was a perfect example of the Renaissance Tudor noblewoman. Born at a rare moment in history where women were able to gain more education than they had ever had before, and when religion was at a pivotal moment in England, she would embrace both. She would use her education to form opinions and wit that won over many, as well as earning her enemies, and her faith would remain the pillar to which Catherine clung throughout her life. The death of her first husband, her 2 young sons, and her exile into Europe were trials she had to live through that didn't diminish the flame of her spirit, although it seems Catherine took on a puritanical edge that would both push her away from the Queen's favour and make her admired by Protestants who wished to push what they saw as the true faith. She also married for love, something not usually open to noblewomen, and she also maintained control over her own estate to pass on to her children. Catherine would go down in history as one of the most interesting people who was part of 3 royal courts, as well as being part of many of the events that shaped them. She was also one of the most outspoken, steering her family through the tumultuous Tudor period with an unfailing resolve. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.